Good evening and welcome, everyone. I am so delighted on behalf of the Forum team to welcome you to the historic Forum complex and to the soon-to-be Forum Cafe. Before you ask, we're opening sometime in April. Can't give you an exact date yet. And we are particularly excited to share this opening with the Black Metropolis Research Consortium. Dr. Sumaya Ahmed and Gabrielle Banks are in the room, who will be opening their space right next to this at the same time. And of course, who are hosting this wonderful discussion that we're about to have. I'm also really excited because, as I just found out, the author, Dr. Stovall, has deep family connections to the Forum with grandparents and parents growing up in Bronzeville and spending time in Forum Hall. So there's that connection. And then, as I think we will find out, the topic of the book and the discussion is very pertinent to what has happened to the Forum and to many other spaces in our community. So I want to just welcome you all. After this, we may do some quick tours of the space. I want to encourage you to do that and to think about coming back as we open both of these spaces in April, and our next big celebration, International Jazz Day, April 25th. I think we'll be open just before then here as well. So again, welcome and thanks for coming.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. I'm not sure what it is. Yeah. So my name is Sumaya Ahmed. I'm the director of the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, which is an organization that turns 20 years old at the end of this month. We are a consortium of 29 libraries, archives, and museums that was started in 2006 with this goal of locating the archival material, the records that document Black experiences in Chicago. So with that in mind, was to locate them, make sure they're organized, make sure people have access to them, and then to make sure that we use them. And so one of the ways that we thought about how would people use these archives, one of the first programs that was started in 2009 was a research fellowship. And that gave scholars, artists, anyone who wanted to do research in our members' archives focusing on Black Chicago history, gave them a stipend to either whether or not to come to Chicago or to be, if they were already in Chicago, to do the work that they needed to do to have access to the archives related to Black Chicago history. Over the years now, we've given more than 141 of those research fellowships out. We've had more than 30 books published, and I think we can say that Dr. David Stovall's book is the latest book from a BMRC fellow, research fellow, to come out. So I won't spend too much time talking about us. You can look us up on the internet. We have a lot of amazing activities that are going to happen. As Bernard said next door, we're going to have an exhibition about our 20th anniversary. And we have a lot of things planned. We have a symposium on Black Chicago history happening June 17th and 18th. And we have an oral history project, a lot of things. But there'll be more on that later. Right now, I just want to introduce our speakers for today. So we have Dr. David Stovall, who is a professor in the Department of Black Studies and Criminology, Law, and Justice at the University of Illinois, Chicago. His scholarship investigates three areas: critical race theory, the relationship between housing and education, and the intersection of race, place, and school. In an attempt to bring theory to action, he works with community organizations and schools to address issues of equity, justice, and abolishing the school-prison nexus. His work led him to become a member of the design team for the Greater Lawndale Little Village School for Social Justice, which opened in the fall of 2005. Furthering his work with communities, students, and teachers, his work maintains itself in his involvement with the People's Education Movement, a collection of classroom teachers, community members, students, and university professors in Chicago, Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area, who engage in collaborative community projects centered in creating relevant curriculum. In addition to his duties and responsibilities as a professor at UIC, he also served as a volunteer and social studies teacher at the Greater Lawndale Little Village Schools from 2005 to 2018. And today, Dr. Stovall will be in conversation with Damon Williams. Damon Williams is a movement builder, organizer, hip-hop performing artist, educator, and media maker from the South Side of Chicago. He's the co-host of Ergo and co-founder of the movement media and journalism hub Respire Production and Media. He's also the co-director of Let Us Breathe Collective, an artistic activist organization birthed out of supply trips to support the Ferguson uprising and resistance to the murder of Mike Brown. That Stewart's movement building, the center's community building. I'm sorry. Excuse me. It's been a long day. Let me start over. An artistic activist organization birthed out of supply trips to support the Ferguson uprising and resistance to the murder of Mike Brown. That Stewart's movement building, community centering. With the mission of utilizing cultural production and popular education to redistribute power and resources, eradicate systemic violence, and transform inequity. Damon has been named the Time Magazine's 2020 Guardian of the Year, a Field Foundation 2021 Leader for a New Chicago, a Margaret Burroughs Fellow by the UIC Social Justice Initiative's Portal Project, and a Power of Cash Narrative Change Fellow by Economic Security of Illinois. And we will turn the floor over to Dr. David Stovall and Damon Williams.
Well, peace and greetings, y'all. I hope this finds everybody in good spirits. Happy to be on 43rd. Yeah. In real time. And just something, what we wanted to do again, thanks again to the Sumaya and the Black Metropolis Research Collective and the soon-to-be open Cafe 43 for having us on deck. And, you know, and I think it is only right before we begin to just say out loud, justice to our brothers and sisters in Palestine, justice to our brothers and sisters in Haiti, justice to our brothers and sisters in Iran, justice to our brothers and sisters in Venezuela, justice to our brothers and sisters in Jamaica, and justice to our brothers and sisters on this planet who have made the demand towards justice. Okay. Right? I think in this moment, it's important to name that when we are dislodged from so much. What we wanted to do today is literally just do a brief introduction. Me and Damon get into a conversation and then kick it back to you all for some dialogue. And again, being back here on 43rd is always important to me as a Chicagoan because my colleagues tease me and reference to me as a Chicago nationalist. Right? So I'm always like, I'm always in the spot because it's Chicago. Like that's always my response to things. But 43rd has a very unique relationship, not only to the book, but actually to my own family's life. So my uncle Malone Wilson just passed 2 weeks ago at the age of 103.
Oh, that's a shame.
Right, so he lived right here on 50th in Michigan. And my father grew up in Ida B. Wells homes. His mother, my grandmother, was one of the first residents of the Ida B. Wells homes in 1941. My mom lived across the street from what is now the Center for Inner City Studies in a building that is no longer there. And one of the things that always amazes me when I talk to my father, he tells a story now as a Chicagoan. This is another random Chicagoan. And you have to be and this is always, I find myself becoming the old dude, right? So if you're a Chicagoan of a certain age, you know of this place on the corner of Pershing and Cottage Grove. And Pershing is actually not 39th. I mean, Pershing is 39th, but it's Oakwood and Cottage Grove. So Pershing is like 39th, Oakwood is like 39th place. Mm-hmm. So on Oakwood and Cottage, kind of facing Drexel, used to be a theater called the Oakland Theater. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, in the 70s and 80s, we knew that as the Fort, right? And the Fort was the headquarters of the El Rookets. And around our neighborhood, we refer to them as the El Rise. And that space becomes a very contested space, not only in terms of when it was occupied by the El Rookin, formerly the Almighty Black Keystone Nation, but also that my father, when he would go to the Oakland Theater, he would always say, we could not walk east.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So Drexel actually was this marcation line, right? And this is when King Drive was South Parkway, right? And I had an aunt who lived on the land where the Dan Ryan currently is, right? She got eminently domain for the construction of the Dan Ryan. So when you put all this together, you start to ask questions about, well, what does home mean? And how is home disturbed or interrupted? And then more importantly, how can you be made to not only forget where you come from, but be mad at the people that you are closest to? And this is an event, not just a machination of racial capitalism, not just a machination of late stage capitalism, but to really think about what is the conversation that white supremacy and late stage capitalism is having with each other. How does it play out in real time with people? And how do we have an analysis of that when we think about violence? And more importantly, what are people doing to change their conditions given these things to be true, right? And I think that's the site of struggle that I try to approach the book, but also thinking about that as not just Chicago, but that is a world problem. That is a global problem, right? If we go to Lisbon, Portugal, we're gonna be having conversations about gentrification, violence, the transnational drug trade, and prisons, right? If we go to London, England, we're gonna have that same conversation, right? If we go to Accra, Ghana, we're gonna have that same conversation. So it's one of these things around Chicago became this passageway to talk about the world, right? And now begin to ask those questions in a deeply intentional way, right? So I just wanted to say that before me and Damon talked, to just kind of give you all a sense of the approach I took to writing something like this.
Everybody, let's put our hands together and applaud Dr. David Stovall, author of Engineered Conflict, Structural Violence, and the Future of Black Life in Chicago. Very beautiful text. Also want to shout out Haymarket Books for publishing this. And I want to start kind of with a lot of what you was just putting down in that introduction. And you talk about this notion of homemaking. And so I just want to applaud you. Reading through this felt in many ways like a warm blanket for me, because I just have a love and a gratitude when someone sees my home both with humanistic heart, but also with like a rigor and diligence. It helps me understand parts of my life and my environment that even if I understood, now I know and am informed about. And so thank you for this work. Thank you for this contribution. It's so powerful. And I want to start with this notion of home you were speaking on and the Chicago nationalism of it all. In the text, you say you view your work in the frame of critical race praxis, and you talk about yourself as an activist scholar, and that is something that you, I think, encourage other practitioners in academia to take on that responsibility. But it is, in my purview, it is extremely rare for an academic or a professor to work in the city that they're from, particularly in a public institution that they're from. And you as a Black scholar that is drenched in the Black liberatory tradition, I think you reference Eve Ewing here a lot, who's also in Chicago, at the University of Chicago. But tell me a little bit for you about this notion of being an activist scholar at home. What deepens the responsibility? Why is it rare? And how does that inform the way you went to this work in a way that wouldn't be possible if somebody who was from somewhere else was at UIC, or if you were studying at Stanford or somewhere else and trying to write this piece?
Yeah, I think, and thank you for that, because the thing I think about the most, well, let me just explain this other thing. It's rare for academics to get jobs in the places that they're from because of how academia works, right? So you interview in all these different places, and then there might not be an opening in the place that you're from, right? And funny little UIC story, I got the UIC interview hella random. Like one of the homies literally called me, he was like, bro, it's an opening in UIC. I was like, all right, what? He's like, look, just put your paperwork in. I told him to be on the lookout for your paperwork. Then I tell my mom.
All things come through hookups.
That's right. That's a Chicago way, right? So
put you on?
my mom, I talked to my mom, and she's like, "Oh, child, you got that job." She was like, "Don't even worry about that." But I think the thing that, to your question, it deepens the responsibility, because I would always get deeply upset when folks would talk about Chicago and not know it, right? So that I always felt like that was just like the ultimate sign of disrespect, right? So like the Chi, right? So Lena Waithe, who lived in Chi until she was 12, then moved to Evanston. It's like, don't do that. Don't do that, right? I mean, I need, or like the Bear, right? It's like, don't do that, right? Don't.
My least favorite was Shameless.
Yeah, oh man, it's like,
It's like, it's a good show, but where the hell is this supposed to be?
What are we talking about?
What is happening?
Where was River north of Green area? What are we talking about, people? And these are supposed to be writers from Chicago. I'm like, man, what? So I won't even, so like my homies are always like, but the Bear, the story. Look, you gotta get, if you're gonna do it right, get the Chicago story right? Because there are people on other parts of the planet who get that story right. Ryan Coogler in Fruitvale Station got Oakland right, right? Because he is from Oakland. Oakland was a character in that story.
Right.
And I think it deepens the responsibility, because so many people have shallow conversations because they don't know the place from a different perspective, right? You can go deep in some spaces, like there's a text, a very intense text called Great American City, that's about Chicago. But it's just a bunch of data, right? It's a bunch of data just is kind of rambling, right? And I'm like, there's life in those spaces. How do you talk about the life in those spaces? And then I also think that there's a responsibility to address and struggle with the contradictions, right? So what does it mean that you live that, and I'm talking about my own home, I live next to a space where there was a family from Mississippi whose house got foreclosed. They couldn't pay the taxes on it. The city of Chicago sold it to a developer. That developer now charges anywhere from 8 to 12 times more than what that house would actually go for in sales. And now that is 10 feet away from me, right? What does it mean to be in Woodlawn, and now the University of Chicago has crept south, right? Despite an agreement that they wouldn't, right? So this thing around, how do we wrestle with that contradiction? And I think there's a responsibility there, right? Because you're talking about it as you live it. And we always talk about people who do their best to live things. You know, as young folks, y'all say it hits different, right? And it sounds different, right? Because that person is utilizing a perspective that's allowing them to say, there's some things here that we need to take into account. And when we don't take those into account, we hollow out the story, right? So how do we tell the story with all its shortcomings, but also at the same time, recognizing the shortcomings, recognizing our participation in those contradictions, and then what we are trying to do in real time to change conditions, right? So I think that gives another component to the work, but a deep responsibility, because you cannot be in spaces and talk about things that you do not know, right? That is a Chicago mistake, right? You cannot do that thing, right? People will come for you all the time, right? And in writing the book, I was like, man, I literally was thinking like, man, what were the homies from the block, and they get a hold of this, and they look at it and be like, look fam, over here, no, no. But this thing around really being deeply intentional about that, because I think that responsibility comes with a space, and I think we can say it, right, where people are slowly being disappeared, right, in a very explicit way. So how do we tell that story? Because now we live in a world that says those things never happened, right? They will try to erase those things. So now, what is the responsibility of holding memory, but also being willing to engage the contradiction.
Yeah. So a collective memory that I think you work through with great nuance and precision is the significance of street organizations in this story. So, you know, there are other things more foundational. We're gonna talk about housing, we're gonna talk about school, but in terms of your approach and your praxis, there are texts that like give history of the stone, you know, shout out Natalie Moore's piece, and you know, there are gang history books that exist, but there are a lot of deep study of the structural, political, white supremacist effect on Chicago that also takes a real look at street organizations with some discipline, but also from an insider point of view. And so for you, one, what is different about how you gather material, how you get analysis, how you get checked, who you check in with about that conversation. And then also, I think, just like the work of humanizing, because the gang label has basically been a way, like colonial language for savage, for terrorist, for thug, for expendable, for disposable, for blight that needs to be removed. And I think you don't romanticize, or you struggle with the instinct to romanticize, I think, but then have a real diligence of why this is important to the story. What was the process of how to academically look at these street organizations that shaped your childhood, shaped my childhood, shaped this whole region of this city, and the world, really?
Yeah, and I think for me, it was really sport. Right? It was sports, right? It was literally, when you would hoop in certain areas, it was like, okay, we out west.
They are shaking hands.
Right, like, that shake different, right? So you like, we out west, and then you're like, oh, we out west. And then you say to yourself, all right, it's different. Like, I remember my cousin, who, long time West Sider, shout out to North Lawndale. I remember one of the first times I go to North Lawndale, I was like, man, is it a street festival West Side? You know, like, it's just people outside. I was like, everybody else, I was like, damn, like, everybody is outside. And it was hot, so people was outside for a long time. I was like, damn.
Shout out to my Southsiders. Y'all think we be outside? We do not be outside, boy, the West Side. The West Side be on the block.
Or should be somebody.
So you out there and you looking, and then you say to yourself, all right, we had a quote unquote pass sometimes, right? Because we hooped. Now, some cats that we might have hooped with may also be affiliated, right? So now we have a different conversation, and it made me think about the ways in which order worked, right? So a guy who was a year older than me had rank within the Four Corner Hustlers. And when he had, like I said, he was a year older than me, but he would be calling meetings, right? And I'm like, I'm like, damn, shorty calling meetings, shit. You know, and we like 13, right? And I was like, so how dare we call this thing not an organization, right? So I mean, I think that's just an inaccurate depiction, right? And then really talking, and shout out to Lance Williams, who wrote this excellent piece on David Barksdale and Richard Daley. Because what he really started to engage in, kind of connected to him and Natalie's book in terms of the Almighty Black Peace Stone Nation, because we always knew, so I grew up in a neighborhood where it was literally Four Corner Hustlers, Black Stones, Vice Lords. That was it. And anybody who came, I mean, and to give you kind of a sense of this, I still am a bit shaky if I have on the colors black and blue, right? I'm still like, I need to be, what's going on, right? I mean, like that, and literally that just
like my hat is tilting a little left,
it's not feeling right, But this thing around what that meant, and I remember when folks would show up, and when my guys first learned the assemblage, one of the assemblages is a pyramid with 21 bricks. And I remember one of my guys saying, you gotta make sure all the bricks 21, because it was in reference to that main 21 that was the collection of sets that all unified under BPSN, the Black Peace Stone Nation. So that piece, and what Lance put me onto, and I didn't know this about GDs as much. Gangster Disciples, for people who know it. Gangster Disciples were also a federation, right? So they were a federation of Egyptian Cobras, Devil Disciples, Englewood Disciples, right? So they were all a collection of folks, right? So now, and then it made me understand the beef between BDs and GDs, which I never got, right? Because David Barksdale, or Donnice David Barksdale, was actually a Black disciple. Larry Hoover was from a set called the Supreme Gangsters. Their coalition became the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, right? So now when you think about that coalition, so for me it was always talking about like, we need to understand the coalitional relationship there, right? And more importantly—
And it didn't come without cost.
And it of course, not coming without cost. And then there's this brief moment of organizing against the Chicago machine, right? There was a brief organization, a coalition called LSD.
Started in 1970.
Yep, Lord, Stones, and Disciples. And they tried to get together around construction contracts. So now there was an analysis, and Ford had already got some federal money that messed up. But again, it's important to talk about that, right? But I think when you start to group that set of relationships together, it made me think about, well, these are the folks, quote unquote, that we're blaming for the quote unquote violence problem. But when you look a little deeper, the machinations of police forces, white supremacy, under something called Operation Headache in the late 90s, did something in Chicago that they thought would have a different effect, right? So many of us are familiar with cases that have the term RICO, right? A RICO case is a racketeer influence corrupt organizations case, which means that one person can be tried for one infraction. People connected to them can be charged collectively. That worked very well with the mafia. It absolutely backfired when we were talking about Black street orgs in Chicago, because the leadership was so central. So when you splintered leadership and you locked leadership up, you had young folks who were left to fend for themselves. The other thing that happened to that grouping of young folks, they also got displaced into communities that they historically had conflicts with. So now when you think about this in real time, it made me say, well, there's a different question here. Before we chalk this up to gang violence, we gotta look at a set of machinations that actually lead to this.
Correct.
And you can't talk about that without the destruction of public housing, without the closing of schools, without the relationship to law enforcement, right? And they literally talk about it. And one thing, I'll end on this. I used to live on 73rd Place off of Ridgeland, right? And that's like edge of South Shore, right? And there used to be a space where my grandmother lived on 71st and East End.
Okay.
And there was, I remember when I was in high school, there was this thing, and I'm dating myself. This is when people had pagers.
All right.
Right? So folks, I graduated in 1990. So, yeah. So literally, there was a strategy where they would turn off payphones after 10 o'clock with the hope that would curb drug trafficking, right? But what actually did, it just moved it. Right? But the thing that was most important, people think about this stuff like you all discovered with Let Us Breathe, that we think to be urban legends, right? People didn't think that Home and Square was real.
Right.
But we always had an understanding as Southsiders, don't get caught up out west because you could be in a spot where you could be tortured. We didn't know the name Home and Square,
Right.
but we knew that thing existed. So with this program, me and a grad student, Emily Pierce, I said, well, this thing used to happen on the South Side, and I asked a former city council person, and she said, you're absolutely right. She said, but the place that you're gonna find it is not in the newspapers. said, you're gonna find that in the daily record of city council. So we start going into city council and we find this program called Hang Up on Bad Guys, right? And all it was cutting off payphones in quote unquote drug hotspots, right? With the hope that it would curb movement. So now this thing around, even though they were never given credit as such, they were dealing with organizations, right? And they dealt with organizations to the extent that they thought something that worked with another organization to lessen its power actually created something else, right? And I think when we talk about street organizations in that way, I wanted to complicate the conversation because we often just think about the violent young person with a weapon, but we haven't taken that back to, well, what was the process that actually got us to this moment? And when you don't talk about that, it just lessens the space and it makes more room for the colonial narrative around who will be disposable.
And so in this story of disposability, displacement, and this engineering of toxic conditions that then lead to conflict, a central site, as is obvious, is housing. And particularly in Chicago as like the mecca of experimentation with public housing, appropriately or inappropriately then called projects. And so to accentuate or to celebrate the scholar activist practice of you, reading this was really beautiful for me because about 7 years ago, I don't know if you remember, you came into the workshop at the Breathing Room with through the entry of abolition, and you talked about how segregation was not just about the plunder around property value, was not just about you being over here or I'm here. It was also about this process of confinement that was explicitly and implicitly carceral. And so for people who identify in this language of abolition, or how do we move away from carceral systems, the site is not just the prison or the jail, or even sometimes the way it can be clear to us that the school can be a site of carcerality. These housing projects were not just disinvested from or not taken care of. The way that the literal streets were designed, the way that policy, the way that banking structure and investment work was to confine and basically create a functional open air prison that was a few miles by a few miles. And so one, I would just like you to talk a little bit more about this idea of how public housing was not just inadequate housing that when it became poor Black people, they then stopped paying attention to. It was explicitly designed to confine folks, and then how the displacement and the splintering was part of this engineering of conflict.
So I think it's really important. We rarely do this with public housing. I think this is why one of the homies, I just saw this t-shirt that said, America needs historians, right? Because we often miss this story. When we talk about public housing in Chicago, there are two people that are critically important. One is a woman named Elizabeth Wood, and the other person is Robert Taylor. And Elizabeth Wood was the first she was the first president of Chicago Public Housing. And remember, so there's a couple of sets, and there's this strange relationship between federal public housing and then the Chicago Housing Authority. They're two different groupings that actually operate with two different sets of money. And to me, when you started to look at, when people tell the story of the Robert Taylor homes, it is often absent Robert Taylor. Robert Taylor actually opposed high-rise public housing. Right? He said it does not work. You cannot do repairs equitably, and he actually says you will cause more harm. Right? He literally writes this, and Elizabeth Wood agrees with him.
White woman, Black man.
White woman, Black man. Right? So they both say, look, your most sustainable, and they use these words in the 40s and 50s. Your most sustainable set of housing is low-rise public housing because you can actually repair it in a particular way, and you can actually employ residents to be responsible for oversight of the repair. So they literally lay out what sustainable housing is.
What it looks like.
What it looks like and how it can be done.
And did a little bit of it.
Right? So if you think about places, and they had these interesting relationships, so like a place that we rarely talk about, There's a Trumbull Park Homes here on 103rd in a place called Jeffrey Manor. Trumbull Park Homes was a partnership between Wisconsin Steel, the Chicago Housing Authority, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, right? As a place for workers to get sustainable housing, right? So you have same thing with Lathrop. So the Lathrop Homes is now being redeveloped. I forget the name of this one coffee shop called like Hex, right on the corner of Damon and Armitage, right? But that's the Lathrop Homes, right? So now when you think about that relationship, but bringing it back to the Taylors, Robert Taylor opposed high-rise public housing. Elizabeth Wood was fired. He was removed as chair of the board of the Chicago Housing Authority.
Right.
They name the Taylor homes after Robert Taylor as a fuck you to him, right? And somebody who never picks up on this, and we never make the connection, Valerie Jarrett is Robert Taylor's granddaughter, right? So this thing around putting this in context, and she never talks about her grandfather, right? Who actually talked about his fits of depression, knowing what CHA was doing, right? So now when you put that together, and let's think about this, right? So less than 5 blocks away from us used to be the largest single set of public housing in the world, right? And that's just the Taylors, right? So you got Taylors, Stayaway, Dearborn, Ickes, Hilliard, right? So now think about the largest single set of public housing in the world. How many public high schools serves the largest set of public housing in the world, right? We think 3, but it's only 1. The neighborhood high school to the Robert Taylor homes was Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, right? Dunbar is a citywide school. Phillips is a neighborhood school where the attendance boundary goes east, right? So now when you think about this, this was a plan that was set up for people who were thought of already before its construction as disposable, right? Because the progenitors of the plan said it would not work, right? So now when you think about that into the plan of transformation in 1999, you literally have this false guarantee of what they refer to as one-for-one replacement, right? So they promised residents of the Taylor homes that they would have replacement housing in no less than 3 years. But in the plan, so when you read the plan for transformation, at the back end of it, they say they don't have enough money to enact it. I mean, it's in the plan that they don't have enough money, right? So now
The hope for transformation.
It's the hope for transformation, right? So now, literally, 26 years after the development of the plan for transformation, the Chicago Housing Authority has only built 36% of the housing that is destroyed, right? So this thing around putting that in broad context. So now when you think about that displacement, where did people go? And then how people mess with data, right? So they say, well, in the Stayaway corridor, crime is decreased by 70%. Yeah, you're gonna get a decrease in 70% when there's no one living there, right?
If you raise the building.
If you raise the buildings, but what happens when you look at it from a different perspective, 3 blocks away, crime increases, or violence increases by another 50%, right? So this thing around putting this in context. So for me, I'm thinking about this engineering, and one of the homies, Catherine Cho, always says this, who was an engineer in undergrad. She now is at a prof at Loyola. But she says this thing, she always says, you have to think about engineering as the elimination of human error. So in looking at public housing, who has been deemed the error, right? And now how will a city rid itself of that purported error, right? But that contradiction, right? The fact that the progenitors of the Chicago Housing Authority knew that it would not work, right? And actually challenged their folks to say, you can't build this, it's not going to work. But the idea of containing a particular population that was quote unquote undesirable, right? And now if you contain that population, you would thusly be rewarded for that containment, right? So folks in those other areas would be rewarded. So for me, it was always looking at that contradiction. That's very clear. And shout out to the BMRC, because I got into some of these CHA board meetings. Y'all, it was the wildest. I mean, like, some of those board meetings were wild. I mean, like, I'm just thinking about the stenographer taking all the curse words. I mean, 'cause it's like, it's niggas like, I will jump over this table and fuck. I was like, oh, like, I'm really reading this in the text. You're like, oh, they are going in. And this was like early days of the Taylors, right? This was like, I was reading it was the Pritchard papers, and it was like 67, 68.
Okay.
Well, folks were just like, nah, man, this is not it, right? Because they couldn't even figure out how to pay maintenance, right? So they were already talking about broken elevators 3 years after the last building was built, right? So this is a structural issue that now people think
It wasn't the tenant's fault that their elevators don't work.
by no stretch of the imagination, right? And D. Bradford Hunt writes about this very succinctly, but I just kind of took from the records to say, there's a contradiction here. When we talk about public housing as this blight, we really got to put into conversation in terms of what was done in that process.
And so talking about this process and really let's hammer in on the engineering of it all. And I'm going to invite you to speculate a little bit, because what this text does is that it demonstrates the processes of white supremacy on a very like measurable scale. And white supremacy can feel like such an abstraction for us. One, because it is large, vague, global, through centuries, but also it is duplicitous, or it's not forbearing its truth. So, similarly to like when we study the Black freedom movement and we see the work of SNCC and we see folks, responding to lynchings or responding to this terroristic violence, we get documentation of the SNCC meetings, of the church meetings, of what happens after the shooting, what happens after somebody's house is bombed or burned, but we don't get documentation of what the citizen leagues was really talking about, right? We get the effect of their processes and their policies. So similarly here, the process is clear as day, right? You create an inadequate environment. There's all of these hostilities. We're not even really talking about white gang violence and the racial riots that is creating as hostile an environment as you can. And then you close down schools. We also have, where the market is playing in this, you then close down the housing. That is a destructive process. But to your point of engineers and eliminating human error, there's a level of like intention that engineering denotes. And so for you studying this, going through these archives, how much of this are folks who have inherited or risen to power and just like absorbing logics of the system and like, oh, this is how policy works. This is how if you want to, increase GDP, you do these things. And how much of it is an explicit, conscious, white supremacist attack on Black life? Of the threat, as we see what's happening federally right now, the threat is this Black blight, and we need to come up with these sophisticated strategies that over decades and pass the baton to multiple generations to enact these policies that are so violent and structured as conflict. How much of it is just like the machine operating and it has its own logic, and how much are people like with agency bringing on this terror?
I think it's the latter to the former, right? So there are people who bring about this agency around saying, well, how do we maintain what the city has been to a particular grouping of people, right? So if you look at the Chicago 21 plan, which is another plan that was written, this is the last years of Daley's life and time as mayor. So you can go and look at the Chicago 21 plan. Now, here's what they do in the Chicago 21 plan. They name 21 wards, right, that have been, quote unquote, blighted. But they use a particular language. They talk about how they want to return the area to its original inhabitants. They are not talking about the Potawatomi or the Council of Three Fires, right? So that is not. But so now let's think about that language and let's think about the location of those 21 wards, right? So those 21 wards, and they give you overt, and a good friend of mine calls it the hidden overt messages. So some of you all are old enough to remember signs around the city that said neighborhoods alive, and they had a 21 in a circle in the sign, right? So it was literally naming those 21 wards, right? So that neighborhoods alive 21 was the marker, right? And then they would, throw those, and there's a section in the book where I write about the red X's, right? So some of you all remember in some neighborhoods, these red X's were deeply prominent, right? So you could see them out south, you could see them out west, but they
X's
were
on buildings that are deemed to be demolished, right? That they are not fit for repair. So if a fire happens, let it burn down. It's basically saying this is something that can be removed.
Yep. So now those X's, when you look at those concentration of X's, you can now look back to that Chicago 21 plan and say, well, what is currently in those 21 wards, right? And now when you think about those 21 wards, about 17 of them have experienced a significant level of development. And I'll give you all one example. So many of us, and for the younger folks here, y'all might go to Fulton Market, right? So, and it's an interesting piece because my uncles used to work in Fulton Market, right? So, and they used to work in the meatpacking houses in Fulton Market in addition to back of the yards, right? So now when you go on Fulton Market, you see a space that was located for blight, but now there is a restaurant in Fulton Market that pays $100,000 a month in rent.
Wow.
Right, so now the question that we have to ask is,
that's why them drinks are damn high.
Right, exactly.
They
right.
100,000, that's quite enough.
Right. They paying rent. That drink is them paying rent, right? So now when you think about that, the question becomes, who is that for, right? So a good friend of mine had, I think, a perfect description of Fulton Market. He says they want to market Chicago as a Midwestern city for all to visit, right? So when you go, and now Google is headquartered in Fulton Market. You got all these
McDonald's, got some stuff over there.
McDonald's, Dyson, vacuum cleaners. So all of these spaces now have space in that space. And now what happens is it creates a perimeter. And that perimeter becomes very salient around who is welcome and who is not. And now, to your point, it is this idea of now who is acceptable and who is vagrant or disposable, and we can eye them, we can mark them, right? And it's an intensification of the notion that you're not supposed to be, right? So as a 53-year-old, when I'm in Fulton Market and I'm with my partner, I'm always like, what the? I was just sitting there like, what is going on right now, right? And I remember, let's say you had this kind of brief moments of psychosis. I'm like, no one is from Chicago, right? You just like saying it out loud in those ways, but there's like this faint reclamation of space, right? So because we know that area to be something different, right? And now with that particular machination, and we can look at it in schools, right? When people so there was the program called Renaissance 2010, which was a plan, and they talked about what they refer to as underutilization. So the question I would always ask is, well, what's in that term, right? And underutilization was very vague, but when you broke it down, it was literally talking about a fire code. How many young people could be in certain spaces with the capacity to move around and get out of the building, right? But what they took away from that was all the community spaces that were in that building. So now, because it's not enough young people there according to the fire code, it is underutilized. So the language becomes important, right? Original inhabitants, underutilized, blight, right? And can be used in ways to shift capital, right? So one of the areas that got the most money to repair blight was the LaSalle TIF district. Right? So they got the most money, right? And it's like, and I talked to a good friend of mine, Rachel Webb. I was like, Rachel, where is the blight in the financial
Yeah, I was
district?
gonna say this is the financial district.
Yeah, she was like, where's the blight in the financial district? And she was like, look, she said they used a particular equation that had language that any need of repair could count as blight. Right? So literally, they were fixing floorboards, right? We had a meeting with a guy, so the Latino Policy Forum had a meeting in the Federal Reserve Bank. And this story just blew me away. He said, so the head of external relations, I don't know what that person does for the Federal Reserve, but he said, he literally was sitting down, he said, right now there's $15 billion in cash right below our feet. You know, of course, the host was like, well, who got the keys to the basement, right? But this thing around putting that in context, how do you market an area for blight that has $15 billion in the basement, right? So now you have to ask a different question, right? But I think the way in which that language comes out, right? And we have to be very careful around how that language is operationalized, right? So if it is development, then it's development for whom, right? Under what terms and conditions? If it is underutilization, compared to what, right? If it's returning original residents, who do we consider to be original residents, right? So I think that language, back to your question, it is the language of maintaining a white supremacist lean in Chicago and limiting any capacity of those who have not been deemed acceptable to the margins, right? And that's more of a European model in terms of city development, as opposed to what was happening in the U.S. with suburban sprawl. But now it's inverted and saying now the city is the epicenter, and now we'll push everyone else to the margin.
So I'm taking the thesis of engineer conflict more or less to be structural violence, or vertical violence as you call it, is the true cause and predecessor to communal violence and horizontal violence. And time again, you talk about, you know, particularly with the closing and merging of schools, and then obviously with the deconstruction of public housing, how these processes of like mass displacement are putting mostly vulnerable people in more vulnerable situations, and then having folks meet at this point of unfamiliarity. And you basically cite time and time again that like with precarity and unfamiliarity comes conflict. And I just want to like unpack that a little bit of, so what is like psychologically happening for those of us who see a responsibility to, even though it's not our fault, but to address the harm and conflict we see in our communities, this notion of lack of familiarity and tension. It's not universal, right? Like everybody who gets displaced doesn't have that. There's a probability that happens when it's concentrated. And so for you, as you were studying the archive, or just somebody who's from Chicago, like what do you see that is happening on like an interpersonal, internal, psychological, social level? We understand these structures fertilize that type of distraction. But then how does it actually play out? Is there anything we can take from that we can intervene on?
I think the thing that we can take and intervene on is this idea. Psychologists often refer to a process that they refer to as a displacement. Now, psychological displacement is very different from a physical displacement or a geographical displacement. A psychological displacement is when you enact your anger out not on the thing that has harmed you, but the people that you are in proximity to, right? And I think that is a very different, and we see it with little ones demonstrate this to us best, right? So when we talk to little ones, they often say, well, what's the problem, right? Well, what's the matter, right? Now, the little one will only reveal that to the person that they are in relationship with. If they do not trust you, they will not tell you, period, right? So now when we think about that displacement, how is that displacement that psychological displacement taking place when you are dislodged from school, when you are dislodged from community, when you have a containment force that now operates around you, right? And I think our intervention can now, this is back to the poet Togo Easton Martin, says we stop looking at the things that actually harm us, and then we start to harm each other, right? So this thing around, so now what is the thing that allows us to look at the thing that harms us, right? And now we can put it in these very straightforward conversations and things like schools, right? So I always use this with my students. I always say, well, look, if I split this room in half, you all are one school, you all are another, I close you and send everybody here, what happens on the first day, right? And under regional segregation, you're already pitted against each other. So now you in fights all the time. So now the question becomes, if that fight has now been engineered, what has it been engineered to do? So now our intervention says, well, you're angry at that person. Do we even know them? Or are we angry because we don't know them and have a fear that they will infringe on what we think we may have? Right? So this thing around, and that's a question of regional segregation, right? I mean, that is the South and West sides super clearly, right? You know, oh, you out west? Oh, right? You over there on the South side? Oh, you with them bougie, like that conversation, right? But really putting that in context, that is structured by segregation. That is structured by the inability to see each other as curative in this process, right? So that thing around, so that's the work that you all do is so important in terms of being able to see the capacity in each other to do work to prevent harm, right? And I think when we think about those interventions, that's why teaching from a critical perspective becomes important. That's why a critical perspective of history becomes important. That's why when we talk about housing, we should only be talking about it in its most sustainable form, right? How can the folks who have the least also have the cleanest and safest place to be, right? So it's a different set of relationships that you have, that intervention now comes in, well, what is possible and what can we do given that possibility? And I always like to point folks, there's an interesting thing that actually Chicago borrows from it, but it actually comes out of the West Coast. Some of you all may have heard of the Stockton, California guaranteed income experiment. And something really interesting happened with that. So there's a group of economists who looked at what was happening in this living wage experiment. So 500 families got $1,000 a month for a year. Any understanding that once the year ended, you know, there wouldn't be any re-up. It was just, so now figure out what to do with this set of dollars. Economists were blown out the water on what families did, right? 93% of those families, the first thing they did was pay bills. 95% of those families went out and looked for work, right? So now it totally interrupts this notion of the welfare recipient or the person who doesn't care about community space. In real time, we see how people will respond. And I think and now Chicago has a guaranteed income experiment. So what we see is that it goes back to an old adage, right? We know exactly what to do, right? But will we do it, right? And I think that's always the question, and one that I'm trying to grapple with in the book is like, we actually know what to do, and there's examples of people who are doing this, but to what extent will that be understood and supportive as part of that healing work?
So we're running low on time. I want to flip to y'all, get in conversation. I'm gonna squeeze one more in. I have about 2 or 3. I'm gonna try to make it, and we're gonna do it real brief. So one, just thank you for, not only including me in the text, but the work of our movement. And like, you name Not Wanting to End on Despair, you place fugitive Black-led abolitionist movement as somewhat of an anecdote or a path moving forward. So one, I just want to acknowledge and appreciate that. But my real question is a little bit spicier. Because what you do well is have a class analysis in this text. And so often in these studies, particularly like the studies that are rooted in Chicago, we just talk about Blackness as a monolith.
Right.
And usually the struggles that are being reported are specifically, or at least disproportionately, the struggles of Black working class and Black poor people. And obviously white supremacy harms us all, and particularly harms all Black folks. But there's an extra acute violence and disposability that Black poor people are experiencing. And so I want to talk about the fact that, one, there are authorized functional collaborators, Black collaborators in this system. But I think across the socioeconomic ladder, there's an internalization of these logics. And I think that's what the book offers, is that there is a way in which you hear Black folks saying it is us or them other Black folks' fault. It is our fault, That's why I can't stand Black folks today. We can't never get our stuff right.
Right.
And there's this like erasure of this harm, this violence, this torture that folks are experiencing. So one, talk about how folks internalize and collaborate with the system, but also how this can heal the way in which we've kind of absorbed some logics about our own people and have assumed responsibility that is not our own, even when we need to take responsibility for what's next to come.
Yeah, and I think that becomes encapsulated. Again, thank you for the spiciness, because look, if we ain't gonna tell the
You
truth.
was gracious. I know you had another chapter in the text where you really went on the Black elite.
Man, so it's just like, look, if we ain't gonna tell the truth, what we gonna do, right? And this thing around, look no further than the Obama Center, right? And we have to have a real conversation about that. Like, we just can't dismiss that, right? And one of the things that I take that to is people ask the Obama Foundation for a community benefits agreement, right? And in that community benefits agreement, the things that they were saying was making sure that folks were not moved off of their properties, that rents were not raised, that taxes wouldn't go up, and that people from Woodlawn would be employed in the Obama Center. Straightforward ass. I was like, damn, that's not hard, right?
They're like, what y'all think we doing this for? We in it for the raised property value. That's the whole point.
That's the point, right? So the thing that comes to me the hardest is when they cornered Obama, and he said, well, if I give one person one group of community benefits agreement, then I got to get everybody else one. What are you talking about, bro? Like, what?
I know how Chicago works. People come out the woodwork. And this was actually, the person who asked this question is now 20th Ward Alderwoman Jeanette Taylor, who had participated in a hunger strike to stop Diet High School from being closed. So this Black woman who is an organizer and is now an elected official was really callously and inappropriately dismissed, but with all the swagger and charisma of Barack Obama, who was a surprise Zoom-in guest to this gathering. They asked him the question and he like completely dismissed the premise of organizing at large, and particularly organizing for a benefits agreement from him.
Right, exactly. As someone who is trained as a political organizer, as a community organizer, around environmental justice. Come on, bro. What we doing, right? But now we got to talk about that neoliberal influence. Because the thing that hit me hard was that right after that, there was a group of folks who were out of Apostolic Church, right there on the corner of 63rd and Kimbard, who put up a sign across the track that I would run at saying, "We trust Obama." And I just kept saying to myself, y'all.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's like y'all, like, what are we talking about here? And then they would do this this point about being duplicitous. So they would have meetings about the future of the Obama Center at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. Now, we think about that now. The class element says, well, if y'all care, y'all get up and be at 8 o'clock. Who got babies? Who got babies, right? And so that is, how practical is a meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday? Who do you want to be there? Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, who do you want, right? So now when we think about that, and now let's look at what's happened in those 7 years. On Midway Plaisance, right off of 60th and Woodlawn, there's a new space, new hotel called The Study, right? They have made a They have made a arrangement where they are still trying to move the YMCA from 63rd and Stony Island to Cottage Grove. They have cleared land on 60, they're trying to clear land, but thanks to Southsides Together, they're fighting it. They're trying to clear land on 65th and Stony Island to build what? A hotel.
Okay.
So now we think about this, and then and let me put one more in. They have what's called the Woodlawn Ordinance. And Jeanette fought hard for this, but then they gutted it. So the Woodlawn Ordinance says if you are 65 years old and a homeowner, your property taxes will be frozen. Now, here's the catch. If you pass away, those frozen property taxes do not go to your next of kin. So now you've created a mechanism that literally instantaneously moves folks out. So now this idea, and Obama again, when confronted, well, gentrification won't happen for another 20 years.
So he said gentrification is not a problem.
Right, yeah, yeah, exactly. And then to say like, well, wait, bro, you have literally you have named the mechanism for this to happen, right? They're doing dry runs right now of galas at the Obama Center, security, the whole piece, go on Stony Island, almost like Saturday nights, you see this, right? So this thing around really putting into that space around saying, that's them, and that's the problem. And we're gonna give to the folks who are deserving.
Right.
So now, what is this language around who is deserving? Under what terms and conditions? And if you have gutted the process under which I can actually have some sustenance of life, then what is the expectation of me, right? And now when we have that conversation, it's, I'm still passed off as, that's a little paranoid, Stovall. I'm like, y'all said it, not me, right? But this thing around really putting it in a different conversation. So I think we have to think about those class elements, but also how it has been weaponized to marginalize certain populations.
So if folks have any questions or anything they want to respond to.
I appreciate, what's your name?
Dave.
Dave, I'm Brad. I appreciate you dealing with a good conversation about the street organizations, because I feel like the people in the street organizations need to be recognized as souls that have value. And I lived in this neighborhood, by the way, Ida B. Wells Projects, and I always treated everybody as though I didn't judge them because they were in a street organization. And there's a lot of wisdom in even the structures of the organizations. I'm glad you pointed that out. And I always felt like these people, if you give them a chance and respect them, they're going to rise. And people need self-respect in the neighborhood. And I always tried to demonstrate that in my interactions in the neighborhood. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Does the new Public House Museum accurately reflect the story?
Excellent question. So I actually, full disclosure, they took, there's a section in the book about the plan for transformation, and they have it in one of their displays. But one of the things that I really appreciate about the National Public Housing Museum is they tell the story of disinvestment in public housing. And I think that's really important, right? And it's a piece that's narrated by one of our comrades, Kianga Yamata Taylor. And she does a really excellent job of talking about the way in which federal housing, so HUD, now would team up with local housing authorities. And then that money would rarely reach the community intended spaces. And she talked about what that meant over time and how it hit spaces like Chicago, Philadelphia, and even spaces like Allentown, Pennsylvania, which had one of the first and largest public housing developments. So she does a really good job of laying that out, and throughout the space, so it doesn't go, and what they are very clear about it's not to glorify or talk about days of yore, right? So it's not this thing around, oh, things were much better, right? But their thing is like, no, you can't tell a story of public housing without telling a story of disinvestment, right? It's impossible, right? And I think they have that in the fabric of the institution. And one of the things that I really like and is an interesting thing, and shout to the artists for this, Spinderella donated some money for, I'm a little older, so Spinderella from Salt and Pepper, right? So Spinderella donated funds, and she created this vinyl library of all former residents of public housing. It's a really interesting piece to see, because when you flip through, you're like, oh, damn, like all these folks who come out of public housing. And I think if you are committed to a critical analysis of public housing, that's the stuff that you do, right? So I think they've done a good job. And I know Lisa Lee, I've worked with Lisa Lee for almost 20 years, and she's been very responsible about telling that story of disinvestment and what people did despite the disinvestment, right? So she talks about those struggles of resilience, but also you can't have and it's one section of the museum says you can't have a discussion of public housing without an acute understanding of the processes and ways in which white supremacy actually controlled who lived where and under what terms. So that I think those things, they're not pulling punches, right? They're not trying to skate from the space, but it's an important piece because museums can glorify these things and not tell that story. Go ahead.
Thank you both so much for your scholarship and also just your organizing and your work. I guess my question is, if you were going to share your thoughts on like the number, not maybe number one, but just your priority of how you would prioritize from a power building perspective, what you think are the priorities in this moment. I feel like that's a heavy question, but just what your thoughts about that are, especially given, the general vibe and what we're living through, and what you think from a obviously Chicago context, like, folks should focus on. Thank you.
I mean, and thank you for that question, because I don't want to sound paranoid, but I think we have to think about this particular moment as something a little more intense than we've seen in a while, right? Not that we haven't been here, but there was the same analysis 60 years ago, right? But we need to understand ourselves as in the war theater, right? So there is an active war being waged on people. And because there is an active war being waged, how do we now think about those fugitive realities, those spaces that are in between, that are not reliant as much on the state, that allow us to move in ways where we can take care of ourselves, right? So it requires us to rethink what learning looks like, right? So where we are educated, it requires us to rethink how we house each other, right? It requires us to think, and Damon and a group of comrades always talk about it, makes us rethink what public safety is, right? That's a very different thing when you're operating in a war theater, right? And I don't say that lightly, right? But I say that in terms of when your body is subject to these things at any given moment, what white supremacy can do to you is literally kill you with 1,000 cuts. So now, how do you see the cuts before they reach your skin? And what do we actively do to make sure that we have those things that allow us to think, imagine, and do differently, right? And I think it's something that's gonna sound super simplistic to y'all. And my brother, Dwayne Davis is here, but we talk about this all the time. We actually have to reframe want and need. right? And that's a very different thing, right? Because, I remember Sam Greenlee, who wrote The Spook Who Sat by the Door, told me this quote once, and it always stuck in my head. He said, look, I want a Porsche, but I got a bike, right? And I was just like, damn, say less, right? I mean, like, but that thing around, and he was saying it jokingly, but he was serious, right? He was saying, so if we think about need differently, then the ways in which we distribute food is different. How we get food to people is different. How we even think about how we are engaging in educative processes, right? Our art is different, right? So now I think it's that thing around, in the war theater, we have to reframe this, right? Because if we're not, we're scooped up in the war theater, and we think that thing in the war theater is right, right? And I think this is the whole thing, because when you really understand the geopolitics of Palestine, Lebanon, Ghana, Burkina Faso, South Africa, Congo, you can see that literally in your spaces. And I'll give you an example of this. 2 weeks ago in Jalisco, the Jalisco New Generation got into a fight with the feds. The people from New Generation would go into establishments and they say, everybody get out. We're about to burn it down. But people miss this point. They weren't interested in harming the people. They were saying, well, if you're gonna fight us, then here's the terms and conditions of the fight. And where we may think about that being nefarious in terms of drug cartels, it made me think about, these are still young people who are not willing to harm their grandparents. So now, where is the transformative element that now gets somebody from Jalisco New Generation to see the capacity of doing something different? Because the reason why they're in Jalisco New Generation is because they have been starved of resources. And that is the most lucrative position that they could get in that space, largely to support their families. But in our head, we have the drug cartel and we have the terrorist, right? And I think that, again, that is unsafe conversation. So if the people from YouTube come for me, I get it. But at the same time, I think we have to, that's what it means to me to rethink existing in a war theater, right? Because now it's gonna change up who you are in relationship to, right? And I think, like here in Chicago, when we talk about folks who may be in street organizations, those are our family members, right? And those are people that we grew up with, right? I mean, one of the most harrowing, and I'll stop here, one of the most harrowing things that I've ever seen. Me and Damon used to teach at Stateville. I remember about 7 years ago, I was on a panel, and I look over to my left, and it's a dude I went to school with. Yeah. I'm like, shit, man, what the fuck? What? I grew up together, right? So now it changes up your orientation to things, because now you see what this has done and how these kind of brief moments shift what is possible and what you do, right? And I think that's, to your question, we have to really be willing to rethink what we do, why we do, and how we do it. And we have to be clear that there is something else that is going to change our relationship with folks. And it's now the discussion of criminality and harm is very different. And when we do that, I think we allow ourselves a different type of capacity to see less of an enemy and more of a liberator, right? Or someone who will get us to the places that we need to be. And like Ella Baker says, someone who is willing to say, we have what we need, but how do we get to it? And that So I offer, and thank you for that again, because I'm always thinking about that, right? As not something far away, but very close and right now. Wow.
I can add to that, and I think I have one answer, but one like more tangible, immediate expression that you're familiar with, and then like my like visionary, true, what I really prioritize. I think for all of us, and the book really outlines it, we just as human beings need to get organized. And I know that word maybe now sounds cliche or diluted in a way, but what is being traced or what's in the shadows of this story, right, is as we had this harmful, but like, you know, mass communities, we also had these organizational structures. And this is across society, this ain't just black folks, and that is disappearing. And it's not even just like radical organizations or the ones that have the political ideology that I adhere or lead us, but Boy Scouts, church, you know, just like people being a part of a collective body. And there is power in that can be exploited, that can be marginalized, but also when you act together as one, it's so much infinitely more powerful, even if it's just 10 to 1 in terms of what you can do in terms of like real politics. So before I get to like the world that I want to see, you know, as fascism is ascending right now, there is also a way that we need to organize in order to intervene in the electoral space. And so, you know, a project that you're familiar with that I want to shout out is the Chicago Black Voters Project, which was birthed by many of the organizers who have been at the forefront of radical movement, of abolitionist movement, of, you know, the organizing that got Brandon Johnson elected, organizing for the Treatment Not Trauma Ordinance, organizing for the Bring Chicago Home Ordinance that the Capitol has defeated. Folks from all these disparate but overlapping spaces of liberatory movement building, there's this recognition that there was a lack of infrastructure. And so the Chicago Black Voter Project aims to be in contact or speak to all of the voters in the 19 majority black wards in the city. And in so doing, then as a block, being able to then insert into the conversation in a way that's can aid or be different than just direct action or just the criticisms that are valid. And so that is an example of a body that I want to shout out, because as we're going into the midterms like imminently, and as we have these next 2-3 years of federal and even local election, there is an unrepresented politic in society. So this isn't my sexy answer. But even if you're interested in third party, if you're interested in non-participation, doing that as an organized block is so much different than you just as yourself advocating, going to a town hall, going to the ballot box. And so whatever you do, find a body of people, and that body can be your 4 closest folks. Y'all go print some $12 t-shirts, you got a little Twitter page, you know what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't have to be the big funded, you know, highly structured thing. We just need people to be in organized containers. So that has electoral approach, because we do need to intervene, because these two parties, one is explicitly fascist and the other is a negotiator, collaborator, and facilitator of fascism and white supremacy. So we can't concede that space. But really, I think we need to be organized so we can take on our full responsibility to take care of each other. So the vision I have, which is, you know, somewhat articulated in the book, is an abolitionist future, a future that creates conditions that no longer allows for the normalcy of dependence on violence to govern our lives, right? What is normal right now, and what we teach 4-year-olds, is that if you do something wrong, you're gonna get smacked. You might even joke, the police gonna come get you, right? Like it's not just the murder, the false confessions, the torture. It is a way of being of how we relate to each other and what is our responsibility when harm, conflict, or lack occurs. And so I envision that we come into these organized containers and they be containers that meet our needs. So what happens if we're on 43rd Street and that's King Drive, we got State right there. If from 43rd to 47th, there was a body of folks who took on the responsibility of feeding just these 4 blocks. What if there was a body of folks who are responsible for mental health and working with folks with mental illness, a free child care space, a free elder care space, a space that is doing education, a space that's doing arts programming, a space that's doing restorative and transformative justice. Now, if that was happening at small scales, and we can imagine something like this, right? Like, you can imagine being walking distance from a library, that's a public good. You can imagine being walking distance from an elementary school, that's a public good. You can imagine being walking distance from a park. Now we have to expand that imagination, we have to iterate it, and then we have to demand it be invested in. And now we have that reality. All those little things I just said are in walking distance from where we are. And now if conflict takes place, now who can you call? There is this infrastructure of people that are in relationship, are skilled up, know the dynamics, know the history, know the politics of a space. And most of what we rely on the state violence for, 70 to 90%, somewhere in there, depending on where you are just disturbance calls. Mm-hmm. So what if the 2.5 million people in Chicago took on responsibility for the 2.5 million people in Chicago? Right now, we have been taught to pass on that responsibility to about 12,000 people, and about 9 to 10,000 of them have guns, right? So what if within walking distance, we could have what in the Let Us Breathe Collective, we call wellness and protection, or WellPro for short. And there's an example I want to shout out that we covered in Minneapolis. So coming out of the George Floyd uprising, there's an organization that emerged called Relationships Evolving Possibilities. And there's a band of radical visionary organizers who were in relationship for about 5 to 10 years prior. One of them is actually, his name is Jason. He's from Chicago, was street involved, and like a big part of what there's exodus. Part of what this story kind of says is Black people have not just like left this corridor of Bronzeville, we've been pushed out of the city. So you got folks in Iowa and Minneapolis and Michigan all over. And so that is informed in this space in Minneapolis. We have this uprising, National Guard, all of these militarized units are wreaking havoc as a way to restore order. And so they start bringing waters, bringing first aid kits, doing basically triage support for folks protesting, folks in uprising. And from that, they said, you know what? We're gonna make a 10-year commitment. And they made a 10-year commitment that they're gonna have an organization that has a hotline. And at least 2 to 3 times a week, there are people who are humaning, I'm not gonna say manning, people are humaning the phones, and they may not have capacity to respond to everything, but what they say is we just try to show up, be a presence, and get people to their next breath. And through that, they have seen a drastic shift and transformation in terms of how people respond to each other in conflict. So that example and the imagination I just had, let's combine those. What if in these 4x4 block units, we were able to resource and organize ourselves to be able to respond to the needs people have? And it won't just be about shootings, right? It won't just be about so-called gangsters on the corner. It would be about my window is broke and I don't have heat. It would be about there's food for 5 people, there's 7 in here, right? There's so many other types of solutions that people don't even have an imagination that you can call somebody for. And what if we as a society were that for each other, with a focus on those who are most marginalized and who need it most? So that's my priority, is we need to get organized. One, because, fascism and I'm a revolutionary. I think all of this needs to go, and something else should emerge from the ashes or the soil. So right now we need some electoral intervention, but that's not really what it's about. What it's about is how do we become new people, and that's how we relate to each other.
And please, again, y'all join me in thanking the Black Metropolis Research Consortium and for